psychic attacks, and self-defense. Bruce Charlton.
I am of the opinion that psychic attacks are far commoner than is generally realized, even by occultists themselves. Certainly the general public has no conception at all of the sort of things that are done by people who have a knowledge of the powers of the human mind and set to work to exploit them. I am convinced that this factor played a large part in the witch cult, and was the real cause of the universal horror and detestation of the witch. These powers have always been known to students of occultism, but nowadays they are known and used by people who would be exceedingly surprised to find who are their fellow practitioners. Mrs. Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, stumbled onto these methods empirically without ever acquiring any rational knowledge as to their modus operandi. She endeavored to teach them in such a way that they could only be used for good and their power for evil should be concealed, but that she herself was well aware of their possibilities if abused, is witnessed by the dread of what she called malicious animal magnetism, which shadowed her whole life. The methods of Christian Science, without its strict discipline and careful organization, were developed and exploited by the innumerable schools and sects of the New Thought movement. In many of the developments the religious aspect was lost sight of, and they simply became a method of mental manipulation for purely personal ends, though not necessarily deliberately evil. Their exponents advertised that they would teach the art of salesmanship, of making oneself popular and dominant in society, of attracting the opposite sex, of drawing to oneself money and success. The amazing number of these courses advertised shows their popularity. In a recent issue of an American magazine, I counted advertisements for 63 different courses in various forms of mind power. They would not be so popular if they achieved no results at all. From Psychic Self-Defense, by Dion Fortune, 1930.
I believe that psychic attacks, of the kind described by Dion Fortune a century ago, together with suggestions for defeating them, are nowadays much more common and much more effective. The reason is that materialism, the absolute exclusion of the psychic or spirit world from all mainstream public discourse, is much more complete than it was in Dion Fortune's day, and this renders people wide open and helpless in the face of those who employ these spiritual methods of mental manipulation for selfish and evil ends. This explains why mainstream Christians are equally helpless against such manipulations, because the major churches have also excluded participation in the spirit world as a valid goal, regarding this realm as necessarily evil, and therefore suppressing awareness of its reality and power. Christians mostly dwell in a world just as devoid of spiritual beings, as that of atheists. What this means is that normal, commonsensical, ordinary people, who pride themselves on being down to earth and realistic, are typically utterly convinced by whatever incoherent and evil-intending beliefs that are currently emanating from politicians, officialdom, corporations, the mass media and celebrities. This is why so many people conform their lives and religions to such manipulations, why they have been so easily, repeatedly and fully hoodwinked into intense yet fluctuating and contradictory mass attitudes, including fear, resentment, self-hatred, promiscuous abstract altruism, and strategic self-destruction, and why they ignore and deny what is being done to them. The answer to endemic mental manipulations via the spirit world includes acknowledging the reality of spirit world, and then becoming aware of it. And including the possibility of psychic attack as among the valid possibilities that affect ourselves and the world. Note: psychic attacks emanate from the spirit world, which is occult/hidden, and immaterial, but needs to be distinguished from the spiritual war of this mortal life that relates to the divine world. The spiritual war is about eternal salvation and damnation, and evil need to be invited in, to some extent. But psychic attacks come from within this mortal world, and are largely to do with earthly manipulations and shorter-term motivations such as power, sex, greed, spitefulness, etc. I am no kind of expert on psychic defense, beyond recognizing that by far the most important aspect is to recognize that one really is being attacked. The pathetic vulnerability of the mass of mainstream modern people stems principally from their refusal to acknowledge even the possibility of psychic attack, and then in extreme absence of awareness of its likely sources, and probable intentions. Become aware, by experience, rather than making use of hearsay. Bruce Charlton. In this bureaucratic and totalitarian world, most of knowledge, including among Christians, including among the most traditionalist and orthodox Christians, is second-hand hearsay without experiential understanding, and this knowledge is only learned as a means to the end of making use of it. Information comes in a template of checklists, bullet headings, action points, generic responses to general problems, that reveals the essential motivation to be the manipulation of reality in conformity to will. On top of this, experience is rigged by ideology and propaganda, such that the implications even of the obvious may be inverted. Likewise, the outcomes of our actions and attempted manipulations are immunized against learning from them, so that whatever happens, ideology is confirmed. Consequently, mainstream modern people actually strive to live their lives like those who make friends in order to make use of them. Our proper task is very different, and includes the need to become aware of much that is unconscious, neglected, ignored, denied. But being aware is not merely knowing about them, in the typically second-hand, externally imposed modern fashion. The necessary awareness is an experience of existential consciousness. We know them by comprehending them in our thinking, as a single and whole action of apprehension. We know them, and know that we know them, all at once. That is experiential awareness, that is learning, and the purpose of such learning is not knowable until after it has happened. To see it is not seeing it. Francis Berger. I have recently returned from a short trip to Florence and Bologna, where I spent considerable time in art galleries and museums I have always wanted to visit, the world-renowned Uffizi Gallery and the Galleria Accademia among them. At the Uffizi, I had the privilege of viewing many iconic paintings including Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, Da Vinci's The Annunciation, Gentileschi's Judith beheading Holofernes, Caravaggio's Sacrifice of Isaac, and countless others. Although it was immensely pleasing to see these works up close and in person, assuming that the works on display are genuine, and not replicas, I could not shake the feeling that I had not really seen the paintings. If anything, I had merely looked at them. Yet, that is all the world's most notable art galleries offer, the chance to look with very little space for study or contemplation. If I stood in one place for too long, I inevitably ended up in someone's way or getting gently pushed along with the current of the crowds that flow through the space like meandering rivers. Either that or my thoughts started tugging me toward the next must-see painting in the adjacent room while my eyes were still fixated on the must-see painting before me. And then there is the matter of masterpiece overload or drowning in a veritable art deluge. So many paintings in one place at one time are simply too much for my mind, heart, and spirit to assimilate. Considering the above, I now regard visits to art galleries as nothing more than opportunities to see great works, the chance to acknowledge that you have been there and seen that. The seeing part comes much later for me, usually at my desk in the familiar comfort of my study. Note added, the one exception for me was Michelangelo's David in the Galleria Accademia, which is exhibited so masterfully that it is difficult to imagine seeing it anywhere else, even though it was originally supposed to be on the roofline of a cathedral. How should we choose our assumptions? Bruce Charlton. We can all see how obvious other people's assumptions are, and how these are completely resistant to emerging evidence. Such is a property of all assumptions, they are prior to and above all possible evidence, because assumptions select and interpret all evidence. This is particularly evident when it comes to large-scale and abstract matters. For instance, geopolitical assumptions are indestructible, even across generations, especially when the assumptions are negative, as when it comes to be assumed that a particular nation, or national leader, is hostile, a threat, evil. Similar assumptions govern attitudes between some races, and these need not be symmetrical, i.e. one race may regard another as intrinsically hostile, but that feeling may not be reciprocated. Of course there is also an element of the self-fulfilling prophecy at work, but even without anything of that kind, such assumptions cannot be overthrown by experience. Yet, although evidence immune, assumptions may be abandoned and replaced. And assumptions must be adopted in the first place, even when they are unconsciously socially inculcated. So, given that factual information is irrelevant, is there any valid basis by which particular assumptions ought to be adopted or abandoned? My answer would be several layered. First, and most important, is awareness. As of here and now, assumptions ought to be, or become, conscious, and we ought to be aware that they are prior to evidence, because assumptions structure our choice and understanding of evidence. So we should not assert that our assumptions are obvious or inevitable, and should not suppose that our assumptions derive from factual evidence. Such a recommendation of what not to do is easier said than done. I break it habitually, several times a day, yet in doing so I am making an error, with many ill consequences. But I still have not said anything about choosing between assumptions. The answer, as with all ultimate matters, is always a matter of intuition, which we cannot go beneath, but which we can recognize and acknowledge as the reality behind our engagement with the world. I think it could be said that, assuming we desire to be coherent, our assumptions need to fit our deepest and most solid intuitions. So, for a Christian, all further assumptions need to fit with that ultimate intuition, including the ultimate intuitions of what being a Christian actually means. Once we have identified our assumptions, we should then choose whether we really do wish to retain them as assumptions, or else replace them with others, as we are free to do. It is a matter of admitting this necessary freedom as our own active choice, and of taking responsibility for its exercise. Meeting the female equivalent of a master. William Wildblood. This is an extract from my book Meeting the Masters, which is relevant to the discussion of divine femininity and satanic feminism. It refers to my contact with a spiritual being who was clearly female despite coming through a male medium. The essence of her message was that love disperses all darkness, which is a statement that is almost trite but becomes profound when delivered by a being who, as in this case, embodied what she said. This encounter dates back to 1979, and I wrote the passage below in 2010. Earlier, when discussing the Masters, I wrote that I had no experience of their female equivalents. I had completely forgotten this talk. However, reading through my notes brings the whole episode back with absolute clarity. This companion in spirit, as she described herself, was obviously a very lofty soul. She emanated a loving gentleness that was profoundly affecting, and the balm of her presence had a consoling quality that caused me to feel an almost overwhelming sense of gratitude to her for taking the trouble to visit me. She had a feminine grace and purity that do not seem to be so highly prized nowadays, but are just as much divine characteristics as will or intelligence. In addition to this, she transmitted a peace that made all troubles and fears just melt away. I remember the radiance of her peace very well. The Masters also brought peace, but the peace she brought had a soothing quality all its own. The question might be asked that, as this was coming through Michael, how did I know it was a female spirit? All I can say is that there could be no doubt. The soft voice, the gentle manner, the whole vibration of the person, all of these were clearly feminine. As always, there was no trace of Michael, and though this being spoke through a male body, the voice was feminine. The scent of lily of the valley she brought with her just confirmed all this. I never knew the Masters to be accompanied by such a heavenly perfume. Nowadays many people talk rather glibly about the goddess and the feminine aspect of divinity. Curiously, this is happening at precisely the time when a true grasp of femininity appears to be being lost, leading one to suspect that there is a political as much as a theological imperative behind it. However, there most definitely is a feminine aspect to divinity, most perfectly embodied by such figures of wisdom and merciful love as the goddess Isis and the Virgin Mary, and, in China, Kuan Yin, and this is the closest I have ever come to experiencing it. It is probably not one many feminists would approve of, though, since one of its qualities is a perfect submission to divine will. I should add that it is the height of wisdom to submit to divine will, since the only true freedom is freedom from self. It is becoming increasingly apparent that certain aspects of modern feminism are actually antipathetic to true femininity because they seek to supplant the traditional feminine virtues, which are, largely, though by no means exclusively, to do with nurturing, intuitive wisdom and compassionate love, with those usually associated with the masculine. It is an old trick of the devil to sneak in falsehood under the coattails of truth, and he has successfully done so on this occasion by corrupting the idea of the feminine under the guise of the pursuit of an entirely legitimate and overdue fairness and equality, with which no one could have the slightest argument. All human beings lose by this, but perhaps the biggest losers are women themselves, who are denied contact with their true nature. I sometimes think that if the balance between the sexes were right, then everything would be and we would finally know true harmony, but that time still seems to be a long way off. The sexes are meant to be complementary, but, in the name of equality, they are increasingly being lured into a competitiveness which can only bring about disequilibrium. The root causes of this are egotism, both male and female, and metaphysical ignorance. It is fine and good to refuse to be bound by stereotypes, cultural conditioning, but we should not forget that there exist archetypes too, independent of human will and imaginings, and that a properly functioning society can only be one in which these are acknowledged. I don't mean slavishly enforced, rather than denied or ignored. For the individual as well, true fulfillment can only come from conforming to one's divine pattern. This is not a plea to return to past modes of behavior which were also unbalanced, but for human beings to learn to be guided by what is real rather than what is desired to be real. The current state of affairs is too far advanced for deviation from that course to be likely at any time soon, but I write these words for anyone, male or female, who might be open to them. The equality referred to here is one of spiritual worth as mentioned in the Divine Femininity essay. It's now safe to torment mankind. Spitefully destructive strategies are only dominant when self-chosen damnation can be assumed. Bruce Charlton. Why is it that it is only in the past few years that spitefully destructive, sorothic, evil has begun to gain the upper hand among the demon-affiliated ruling classes? After all, they have always hated people, and particular types of people, and have always has the possibility of harming and killing them en masse. And destruction is easy, and there are so many possible ways of doing it that such a strategy is almost guaranteed to win. And demons, and those they possess, and those who serve them, absolutely love to inflict pain and destruction upon anybody, including each other, but especially those who are affiliated with God and the good. What stopped them in the past? What made them, instead, mostly subscribe to the global totalitarian, bureaucratic managerial strategy of omni-surveillance and complete control? I think the answer has to do with the state of the spiritual war of this mortal world, the war between God and divine creation, and salvation, and those who oppose all of these. While spiteful destruction has always been easy, historically it was spiritually counterproductive, because suffering and death usually led people towards God. This can be seen in the way that war often used to operate overall to strengthen the side of God and weaken Satan. But nowadays, after atheism/materialism/leftism has been triumphant and in control for several generations, after the deletion of the religious and spiritual, has led to widespread value inversion. This situation has reversed, such that suffering and death now lead away from God instead of towards, and into short-term hedonism and long-term despair, both of which are in opposition to the divine agenda. So, that's why we are only now getting spiteful destruction so good and so hard, so openly pursued, and explicitly planned, where economic and environmental destruction, war, sickness, sex and race hatred, and civil chaos are such major and endemic agenda items. It is because the demonic powers are now, and for the first time in history, confident that the value corruption of the world, and especially the West, has now progressed so far, and is so solidly established, that the demonic desire for tormenting and murdering can at last be indulged on a large scale, without the past fear that an acceleration of suffering and death would be likely lead to the backlash of turning men towards God and salvation. Towards the End of the Morning, a novel by Michael Frayn, 1967. Bruce Charlton. I reread this old favorite comic novel over the past couple of days. I had lost my original copy from 1978, and so I needed to buy another. This is one of those things about the embarrassments and foibles among the upper middle classes, apparently all Cambridge University graduates, in this case, mostly Fleet Street, i.e. London, journalists and their wives and girlfriends. This sounds utterly unpromising, and ultimately it is, but there are some very good life observations of the kind that stay with you permanently, and some laugh out loud funny set pieces that are the equal of anything. The main character's experience doing a television talk show is so funny that I can recall sitting somewhere like an airport lounge or a place waiting for a ferry, and laughing literally uncontrollably, so that dozens of other passengers were turning and staring at me as if I was insane or having a seizure, but I just couldn't stop myself. So, Towards the End of the Morning is worth reading. But I also found it a profoundly nihilistic book. At times when it gets serious, the narrative actually expresses this explicitly, that life is purposeless and meaningless, and overall and especially as life unfolds, it is a pretty miserable and hopeless business. In this respect, the author Michael Frayn epitomizes, for evidence, read his wiki entry, the trajectory of Western culture since World War II. He was one of the first generation of upper-middle-class atheist leftists who took over the mass media in those decades, and by the time this novel was published, 1967, this takeover was all but complete. Journalism had been a mostly lower-slash-middle-class job, done by grammar school boys who left at about 16 and served an apprenticeship, as depicted in Michael Green's excellent autobiographies The Boy Who Shot Down an Airship, and Nobody Hurt in Small Earthquake. But by the 1960s print media was dominated by upper-class boys and girls arriving straight from university, especially Oxford and Cambridge. Newspapers and broadcast media shifted from being about news to being opinion concerning all aspects of society, politics and culture, i.e. leftist propaganda. And the new generation of upper-class, public school, and university media people brought with them the new leftism, focused on promoting the sexual revolution, anti-racism, feminism, and the rest of it. Michael Frayn is a good example, because he was, unlike modern leftists, genuinely very intelligent, very talented, and able to be very funny. He was successful as a journalist, novelist and playwright, and was generally supposed to be, not just clever, but a deep thinker, because he had studied philosophy, and even published an academic book on the subject. Frayn is one of the reasons why the mainstream modern culture of hedonic nihilism happened. He was talented, trendy, admired, he made the new ideology seem cool, fun, exciting. And by contrast Frayn, subtly and by insinuation mainly, made all that stuff about God, creation, the world of spirit, existence beyond death etc. seem childish, silly, obsolete, low status carrot. In retrospect, it is obvious that Frayn was not a creative thinker, but was instead a highly able exponent of standard mainstream ideology, a founder member of the chattering classes, one who took all his primary assumptions from his niche social milieu, and was unable, or uninterested, to seek or understand beyond this. And this is manifested in Towards the End of the Morning because, well, it doesn't really end. There is no sense of satisfaction or closure, it just stops. The simple reason for this is that it is an honest account of how Frayn saw life. For Frayn and his numerous ilk, life is something that goes on for a while. One tries to get as much amusement from living as possible, one works to attain an interesting, enjoyable and well-regarded existence. For a while. And then, life just stops. The given rationale for getting rid of that religion stuff was that it stood in the way of a life devoted to optimizing the emotions. This was especially necessary if life in reality was nothing but these emotions, as science had apparently proved. Note added, it is significant that a novel of broadly the same genre as Towards the End of the Morning from about a decade earlier was Kingsley Amis's Lucky Jim, has a traditional kind of ending, with the hero getting the girl and, in effect, striding off into the sunrise of a glorious future. Amis was born earlier enough to have been conscripted into the Second World War, and, although firmly of the materialist atheist generation, was more of a transitional figure into modernism than Frayn. God can only act upon and communicate through freedom. Francis Berger. In a post from earlier this week, Dr. Charlton pondered the question of how we should choose our assumptions. So, for a Christian, all further assumptions need to fit with that ultimate intuition, including the ultimate intuitions of what being a Christian actually means. It is a matter of admitting this necessary freedom as our own active choice, and of taking responsibility for its exercise. I have been pondering the oxymoronic term necessary freedom since I encountered it in Dr. Charlton's post because I believe it captures the essence of what being a Christian should mean in this time and place. My encapsulation of what being a Christian means rests in an augmented, non-biblical passage from the Grand Inquisitor chapter of Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, augmented parts in bold.
Thou didst desire man's free love, that he should follow thee freely into heaven, enticed and taken captive by thee. In place of the rigid ancient law, man must hereafter, with a free heart, decide for himself what is good and what is evil, and with a free heart, actively choose resurrection and everlasting life, having only thy image before him as his guide.
Aside from providing a simple and lucid description of what being a Christian means, the passage above also includes the necessary freedom Dr. Charlton described in his post. The ancient rigid law did not serve Jesus' purposes and mission. To follow Jesus involved freeing the heart and gaining spiritual freedom. This was not optional but necessary. It remains necessary today, perhaps more than ever. However, Christians insist instead on substituting spiritual freedom with newer ancient laws in the form of strict adherence to churches, dogma, and doctrines. A few years ago, I explored the idea of God's apparent unresponsiveness. In that post, I posited that God is not responding to us because our communications with Him are not creative, and that God will respond to us fully the moment we begin creatively communicating with Him. I added that spiritual creativity requires initiative from us, and that this initiative must derive from freedom. Spiritual freedom is necessary because God can only act upon freedom and communicate through freedom. Put another way, freedom is the only medium upon and through which God will now act and communicate. That is a big part of what makes it necessary. However, the medium is only viable if the beings within it are in freedom. Conversely, the medium breaks down when it is tainted by the prioritizing of laws and doctrines of worldly necessity. Why do some people yearn for resurrected life in heaven? Bruce Charlton. Some people, myself included, although apparently not many people, in the modern West, yearn for resurrected heavenly life. It's what we want more than anything. For us, without it, life is purposeless and meaningless and irrelevant. But why this yearning? Given that we have never experienced it, but have instead always dwelt in a reality that is dominated by entropy and death, and furthermore, a reality made much worse by the operations of evil within ourselves and the rest of the world. From where, then, comes that vision of everlasting goodness which draws some of us towards heaven? Maybe it comes from our personal experience, and this is something we all experience, although only some are aware of it, of the spiritual war between divine creation on the one hand, and the opposed tendencies of entropic chaos and purposive evil on the other hand. We all experience divine creation in ourselves, whether or not we are conscious of it, and it is all around us. Yet we also experience that in this world divine creation is continually being dissolved, and destroyed, both from within us and externally, so our experiences of divine creation are temporary and partial. Yet it is these temporary and partial experiences of divine creation that may form the basis of our yearning for the eternal and unopposed divine creation of resurrected life in heaven. Things are much worse than military analysts assume, because the Western strategists want to lose, not win, and maximize destruction while doing so. Bruce Charlton. While the cultivated ignorance and delusional nature of mainstream Western officials and media are predictable appalling, the supposedly alternative analysis of the West versus Fire Nation war is more deeply concerning to me. The military experts and analysts persist in regarding this as a modern version of the kind of wars throughout history, whereas this is a situation the world has never before experienced. Because the leadership of the Western, i.e. globalist, world, and I mean the real leadership, those who set the Western strategy, are qualitatively different in their motivations from any group of leaders in world history. The military expert analysts assume that the West ultimately wants the West to win this war, which is not true. Those who are strategically responsible for the Fire Nation war, its continuation and escalation towards totality, primarily want the West to lose. That is their core motivation. They mainly want the West to be destroyed, and the Fire Nation war is one of several, simultaneously pursued, means to that end. Destruction of the Fire Nation, Earth Nation and other places are also real motivators, but secondary, optional. Other means to the end of Western destruction include other wars, but also the many long-term self-destructive strategies I call litmus tests, for example the Birdemic Peck, the climate agenda, the sexual revolution, the anti-racism agenda, and the whole raft of leftist political auto-lethalities. On the other side, the core and strategic motivation of the Fire Nation is easily understandable. For normal people, conventional, and historically multi-precedented, the Fire Nation mainly wants not to lose. Wants to preserve and strengthen its culture and people. So the Fire Nation war is grossly asymmetrical in terms of motivations, in a way never before seen, at least never on a sustained and global scale. Indeed, the Fire Nation conflict may not even qualify as a war in the conventional sense, because the goal of the Western leadership is an orgy of insane multinational mutual and self-destruction, which is not really a war. But that is precisely what the Western leadership strategists are working towards. And for as long as so many people are so utterly unaware of the fact, for so long as they continue to think of this as just another war, like so many wars before, for so long they will continue to progress incrementally towards their major goal of destructive chaos primarily affecting the West. Note added, an overall interpretative perspective on the nature of the Fire Nation war, and the world generally, does not derive from evidence, and cannot therefore be overturned by observations. It is a matter of assumptions, not empirical data. Because assumptions both select and interpret the data, nonetheless, the immediate action of the Western side in coercively imposing self-destructive sanctions, and the way that the West has continued to increase these in the face of massive evidence of their self-destructive nature, plus the self-destructive act of the West destroying a major conduit for Western energy supply, could certainly be taken as consistent with the assumption that the war is primarily aimed against the West. Celibacy. William Wildblood. There was an interesting article on the Authosphere recently on celibacy by Professor J.M. Smith with which I am in broad though not complete agreement, and I thought I would offer my take on the subject here. I feel I can comment from the position of someone who has lived both lives, that of the celibate in early manhood and the married with children later on. The celibate phase was intentional not through disinclination, bad luck, negligence or failure, and it was because I was leading a life dedicated to the spiritual path as described in my book Meeting the Masters. I understand Professor Smith's point about the quality of priests being improved by abandoning the requirement of celibacy. It might weed out some of the sexual oddities and encourage more full-blooded males to join a group which they might thereby render more masculine and less effete. It would certainly widen the pool of available talent. But then you have to look at some of the vicars in the Church of England and wonder, would it really? I don't know. I would say, though, that to judge an institution by its defects does give a one-sided view of the overall picture. Professor Smith's article is about priestly and monastic celibacy, but I would like to open up the discussion to celibacy as part of the spiritual path and whether it still has a place. First off, I must say that celibacy is and ought to be difficult. It is not natural, and those for whom it poses no problem are, in my opinion, not properly developed. Fruitfulness and fertility are wholesome expressions in the physical world of joy and creativity. Desire is godly because it is the flame of love as manifested in the human mind and body. Yes, desire is godly, pace Buddhism, but attachment to desire is, if not sinful in itself, conducive to sin. It also binds one to the material world and material things. Now, celibates can be as full of desire as the promiscuous, and sometimes even more so if suppressed energy, given no natural outlet, festers away beneath the surface and becomes a constant focus of attention. But the ideal of celibacy is to detach oneself from the world and be focused entirely on God. The world of matter, the creation, is certainly good, but it is not the creator, and it may be that to have a full relationship with God one must turn away from his things and face directly towards him. As far as we know, Jesus was celibate, and he seemed to ask his disciples to devote themselves full-time to their spiritual lives, which is hard to do if you have a wife and children to support. This may be a requirement only for those who are seeking a deeper contact with God, but we may all have to become celibate at some time if we would attain to that deeper contact. There are two aspects to the celibate life. One I have just mentioned, and that is the need to give proper attention to a wife and family. The married man cannot devote himself to God quite as much as the celibate. His attention is necessarily divided, at least until a certain later stage of married life. That doesn't mean celibacy in itself is positive, but it may be a positive negative. The second aspect is sex itself. This mysterious energy is the most powerful we know of, excepting for some the love of God. While not being a need, it is more intense than any need and more fulfilling in its satisfaction. Some traditions speak of this energy requiring to be turned inwards and upwards rather than expressed outwardly, and would say that outward expression mitigates against the reorientation inwardly, just as a river cannot flow in two directions at the same time. We have to make water flow uphill, back to the source. A lot of spiritually interested people reject this idea nowadays, but it has a notable pedigree, and one wonders if the modern rejection comes from the fact that we simply want to have our cake and eat it too, and look for reasons to justify doing what we want to do or are unable not to do. Energy follows thought. In all cases, it is the mind that matters more than the body. By this criterion, actual celibacy is less important than the state of the mind. At the same time, a mind truly focused on God will naturally seek less external stimulation and result in a body requiring less external satisfaction. In the ancient Indian way of spiritual development, there were 4 stages of life known as asramas. The first was that of the student known as brahmacharya, which lasted to about the age of 25 and in which celibacy was enjoined. Then came the stage of grihasta, which was that of the married householder, wherein one raised a family and fulfilled and enjoyed all the material demands and satisfactions of life, though always within a spiritual context, meaning one of virtue and religious devotion. After the age of 50 came the retirement stage of vanaprastha, when one started to withdraw from the world and focus one's energies more on moksha, liberation or salvation as we might call it in the West. If one wasn't celibate necessarily, then sex was certainly something that should be receding from one's mind and attention. The fourth and final stage was that of sannyasa, which was the life of complete renunciation, and here again celibacy was enjoined, though as the normal age for entering on this stage was 75, that should not be too much of a problem. This all represented the natural path of the soul through the world and returning to spirit, and I think still represents a good path for everyone, though it should be noted that anyone could move into the sannyasa stage straight from that of brahmacharya, if one felt particularly called to the spiritual life. This Indian system tells us that celibacy has its place in the spiritual life, particularly at the beginning and end, but so does married life, in which the full enjoyment of sex is not only permitted but encouraged as a good and healthy thing. There is no rejection of the body here, but its incorporation into a grander scheme of things that has the ultimate aim of union with God, though for this to take place it is expected that the soul is able to move beyond the demands of the physical body, the energies of which must be purified and transmuted. This means desire must be directed towards God. Some might think this Indian description of life stages has no relevance for the Christian, but I believe it has a universal application. If we think of the spiritual path as consisting of salvation and deification, with the former as the preparatory stage and the latter as the ultimate aim, then we might say that celibacy has a role to play in the context of deification as an occasional discipline and necessary condition for progress to be made. Every soul seeking full union with God, which union renders the soul divine in itself, must develop an exclusive relationship with God, and that means all other loves and attachments must be renounced. The creation must be renounced for full knowledge of the Creator. But this may just be a stage. If we say that God Himself has a spouse, which is the redeemed part of creation, so every soul, as a reflection of its Creator, does likewise, and having reached conscious union with the Creator, the soul can then turn back and re-embrace creation, though in the full light of God. Jesus said there was no marrying in heaven, but His first miracle was at a wedding, and religion constantly speaks of spiritual completion in terms of a marriage. There might appear to be a contradiction here, but perhaps Jesus was speaking in terms of earthly marriage. There is also spiritual marriage, ultimately that between God and creation, but also between every individual soul, on the vertical plane with God its Creator, for whom every soul is female, and on the horizontal with its created other half. Celibacy relates to the union with God, but the sanctified soul does not just exist in that union. It also has relationships with other souls, and among these is the reflection of the cosmic marriage of spirit and matter on its own level. Is your understanding of heaven minimalist or maximalist? Bruce Charlton. It is striking how often the expressed Christian understanding of heaven is extremely minimalist. In other words, the idea is that very little happens in heaven. Furthermore, in such a heaven we ourselves are simplified, by subtraction of all sin. Heavenly life is thus described very simply, including discarding almost everything most people might most value in this mortal life, such as family and marriage, and our most cherished creative and other activities. Sometimes, indeed, heavenly life is reduced to the single activity of communion with the divine. This sounds, on the face of it, pretty unappealing, except as a relief and escape from suffering. The usual answer to such objections is that we shall ourselves by then have been transformed, such that what seems now to be an etiolated existence, will, when we are actually in that situation, be wholly satisfying, indeed joyful beyond our current possibility of understanding. It is probably clear from the above that I, by contrast, regard heaven in a maximalist kind of way, as greatly enriched by more, and continuousness, of broadly the same kind of positive things that are best in this mortal life. Thus I regard heaven as a place of more, and more loving, and everlasting relationships, including family, marriage, friendship, and ultimately loving relationships of other forms with other kinds of, non-human, resurrected beings such as animals, plants, and natural elemental beings. And I regard heaven as a place of work, the best kind of work, that work which derives from creative love. Which is to say creative work, fulfilling work, work that adds to, enhances, enriches divine creation. But to return to the minimalist view of heaven, assuming, as I do, that it is indeed mistaken, and apparently rather ineffective as a positive inducement, it is interesting to speculate why it arose. Why might people have decided that heaven must be minimalist? I think it is partly hinted above, by the idea that after sin has been stripped away, not much would remain. Maybe also that it is easier to imagine perfection, which is how some people regard heaven, although I think this is a mistaken emphasis, because implicitly static, if that perfection is simple. I think there is also a residue of historical Gnosticism, by which I mean the pre-existing, among pagan Romans and Greeks, Neoplatonism that captured mainstream and traditional Christianity, and not just the recognized Gnostic sects. This philosophical ideology, permanently embedded within itself what might be termed the religion of gospel Christianity by its metaphysical insistence on philosophical concepts as a mandatory framework for Christianity. Such as an infinite gulf between creator and created, strict monotheism, leading to the abstractions of Trinitarianism, in order to encompass the divinity of Jesus, creation being from nothing, rather than an organizing of pre-existent chaotic stuff, and God and the divine world being outside of time. There are more. Other aspects of this pre-Christian philosophy included a belief that the material was innately evil, and that the purely spiritual was therefore the proper aim, and this led to an ascetic ideal that strove to achieve the greatest possible independence from the material body during mortal life, essentially by subtractive disciplines. From this perspective, it is natural to regard heaven minimalistically, and the denizens of heaven likewise. And the assumption that the divine world, in order to be wholly good, must not change, probably led to the deletion of sequential time from heaven, such that there was neither need nor possibility of resurrected men doing anything in heaven. They would simply be. Even the doctrine of resurrection after death, which could hardly be ignored, was transformed into an abstracted, spiritualized, resurrection body, which body ended by being hardly regarded as material at all, but instead something more like light than everlasting flesh. Of course the minimalist heaven may include elements of reaction against pagan, and other, understandings of the post-mortal life as simply a continuation and enhancement of this mortal life, with more of our desires fulfilled, and less of the sufferings. These are seen as wish fulfillment merely, and wish fulfillment is not, by such an analysis, distinguished from selfish daydreaming fantasies, for example imagining post-mortal luxuries of sex, feasting and/or fighting, according to taste. It was probably not until the advent of Mormonism from 1830 that an explicitly maximalist understanding of heaven, more consistent with the Gospels, commonsensically understood, especially the fourth Gospel, was rediscovered and linked with a metaphysical theology. This included a focus on marriage and procreation, family life, and co-creative activities in loving cooperation with God the Father, and an evolutionary emphasis on divine creation as eternally ongoing, continuous, eternally being added to. Ultimately, as always, this question of minimalist versus maximalist understanding of heaven, reduces to a question of personal discernment based on the deepest intuition that we can arrive at. Having consciously clarified our awareness of the alternatives, we each need to decide which are true possibilities, and which we most desire for ourselves. Spite is all around us, invisible, dominant, the fruit of resentment, fueled by despair. Bruce Charlton. Spite, spitefulness is a strong candidate for the worst sin. I've blogged on this often. Another word for aspects of spite is schadenfreude, but this is more often treated as an amusing foible, trivialized, than recognized as among the worst of evils. Surely we can all, if honest, recognize in ourselves, and infer in others, this most evil of evils, a desire to harm others, to make others suffer, and motivation that will, at extremes, risk or sacrifice even oneself. Surely we have all felt an arising impulse that responds to awareness of happiness, beauty, moral decency, honesty in other people or the world around us. With an impulse of hatred, the urge to destroy it, to smash it. We observe perfection, and then a stab of desire to mar that perfection. The urge may even be yielded to, when harmless, as when we see a perfect reflection cast by a still pool of water. And then respond by smashing it to smithereens by hurling a rock into it. Harmless fun, maybe, a tiny lapse, in the scheme of things, no lasting harm done. Yet if we examine the motivations for such everyday, trivial, destructions we may, if honest, find spite at the root of it. Likewise for our actions against others. These may be rationalized as necessary, or because he deserves it, but at root, the motivation may be spiteful. I want to see him suffer. Most people, most of the time, squash such vile feelings in themselves, and certainly try to forget them, but surely we have all experienced them. And, if we have any insight or capacity to reflect, seen this in other people, including the best people, at times, including those we love the most, and perhaps been at the receiving end of it. People who cause trouble among groups of friends, break up friendships, relationships, even marriages, who spread malicious rumors, mislead, misreport life, who engage in he said, she said betrayals. And surely we have at least thought about doing such things ourselves. Spite is ignoble, it is despicable, but it is real. It is found to some degree in almost everybody, and it is the master sin ruling some people, and many demons. It is seen all through human history, and all around us, yet, spite is hardly acknowledged. Except, maybe, in stories about youngish children. Enid Blyton often included spiteful characters, named as such, in her stories, which is how I first put a name to it. It is regarded as more sophisticated and pseudo-intelligent to analyze spite in terms of other motivations, especially disguised forms of self-interest. So, the harming of B by A is likely to be described in terms of how harming B benefits A, perhaps indirectly, or over the long term. But the point is not whether spite can be explained away, of course it can. The point is to ask the question. Is this spite? We absolutely need to know whether spite is the real motivator behind behavior, because if it is, then such behavior cannot be appeased by fulfilling self-interest. And, like most sins, spite feeds on its own gratification. When infliction of harm brings gratification, then the infliction of more harm to more targets will probably follow. Spite cannot be bought off. Spite will not be satisfied by less than suffering and destruction. Thus when spite is explained away, this merely allows for the undetected and more effective deployment of more spite. And spite is a natural product of the besetting modern sin of resentment, with the dominant ideology of the West being the creation, encouragement, subsidy and protection of ever more resentment groups defined in terms of class, sex, race, sexuality or whatever. And, in the West, the developed world, this is a world of despair, whether actual or incipient. Because nearly everybody lives by the assumptions that reality has no purpose or meaning, and that human life is followed by annihilation. With such assumptions, existential despair is normal and rational, such that self-distraction from this, supposed, reality has become perhaps the primary life goal. When we have so many people who fundamentally assume themselves to be victims, and who despair, the ground is prepared for the operations of spite, first directed against those who are most resented, i.e. the supposed oppressors, but soon, as the sin takes grip, directed against pretty much anyone who in any way irritates us. When the most spite-dominated people are also among the most powerful, wealthy, high status, and influential in the world, then we have exactly what we see around us in the world of geopolitics, global strategy, and the international and national leadership class. This world of sorothic evil. A world in which anything that is, or seems to be, of God, or good, anything apparently manifesting the transcendental values of truth, beauty or virtue. Anything wholesome, innocent, natural, spontaneous, carefree. Any such becomes a prime target for spitefully motivated attack. Yet, up to now, spite is invisible. Trivialized? Explained away. By refusing to recognize the operations of spite in ourselves, failing thereby to acknowledge and to repent its sinful nature, we thereby fail to recognize spite in others. So spite can be everywhere, dominant, and increasing, yet we choose to be self-blinkered against perceiving it. And until we are aware of spite, the operations of spite cannot be resisted, either in ourselves, or others. Leftism now rules the West and much of the world, and leftism is a negative, oppositional ideology built upon resentment, and depending upon continuing expansion of resentment. The so-called political right, of all types, is merely a variant of leftism. This can be seen in its domination by resentments, but of a different inflection, typically in versions of mainstream leftism, for example resenting women instead of the leftist resentment of men, resenting the left-approved races etc. Of course, such motivating resentment is rationalized and explained away on quasi-objective grounds, yet the actuality of resentment as prime motivator is sometimes revealed when spite-driven desires or fantasies are expressed, as well as by the relentlessly negative and oppositional focus of rightist discourse, against. The only alternative to the left is religion. All secularism, all atheism, all materialism, is ultimately leftist. Hat tip, this was stimulated by a comment from Avro G. Earth is a filtration system. William Wildblood. One of the books on the right is called Earth is a School, which it is. A school for the development and refinement of consciousness and a testing ground for the orientation of the heart in an environment so cleverly set up that one can find reasons to believe or not in God, depending on one's desire. I got that phrase from my teachers, but the one that is the title of this piece I came up with on my own, which may explain its unromantic sounding nature. God creates to become more than he is, expanding himself throughout creation, and also to express and share love. But if love is to be real, then it must be freely given, which means that God must create fully independent individuals. They are extensions of him, but they cannot just be extensions of him. They must have their own integrity, and it must be absolute. This means love can be given or it may not. It also means the resulting individuals may freely cooperate with God and creation or resist that, or even, to further their own ends, turn against it. To have the possibility of deliberate, freely chosen good, you must have the possibility of not good. This is why God cannot make a creation that is all good to begin with. Or he could, but it would be full of clones of God who had no independence, and any love would be a sort of automatic, passionless, all-purpose, blissed out and bland everybody loves everybody else equally sort that you see in some spiritual communes, or, at least, you see people imitating that because they think it's what they should be doing. But that is not love, which to be real must be personal. There needs to be a first creation which acts as a selection gateway to the second creation, which is the real one. Nothing evil or dark or in any way damaged or even less than perfect can get into heaven, the second creation. This is why I call the first creation a filter for the second. All propensity to evil in the individual is brought out in the first creation, where it may either be indulged in or made excuses for or justified. Or, and this is the only reaction that gets it through the fine meshes of the filter, repented. The soul makes its choice, and on that choice depends its future, whether it goes on to the second creation, the one in which evil does not just not exist but is impossible, or is recycled through one of the many environments in the first creation which differ inasmuch as they are reflections of the consciousness of the soul. So some are indeed dark while others may be perfectly pleasant, even wonderful by earthly standards, but they are not the heaven of absolute good. If only we knew this for sure, you might say, then we would make the right decision. But that's the whole point. We don't know for sure, so we must make an authentic decision, one that reflects our true self. One could add that we do actually know. All the information has been presented to us. If we choose not to accept it, that it our affair. This idea of Earth as a filtration system, designed to extract impurities in the soul, does not preclude the Earth as a school scenario. Both operate, albeit in different ways. On the one hand, the soul is developed through its experience, expression and experiment in the world of duality, the material world, in which subject and object are wholly sundered. On the other, its inclination to or from itself and towards or away from God is brought out and examined. It is given the opportunity to see itself and to know itself, and also the chance to grow, so that when it does reach the portals of heaven it can contribute creatively to the new creation and experience more of it. Many souls may qualify for heaven, but the greater the spiritual development, the deeper the spiritual participation, and the more the ability to add to heaven's glory. For heaven is not a place of static peace and tranquility. It is the eternally blossoming flower that grows from the seeds planted on earth. Thus, it increases in beauty and glory and wonder, and we increase with it. Why is there evil in this world? The answer to that is simple. There is evil in order to eradicate it completely and let those who wish go on to a world in which it cannot exist. This world brings out and filters evil so that the new creation may be one of absolute good. You might say that Earth is a refinery. Constantly thinking about sin is just as enslaving as sin. Berger. I suppose I should start by saying that most modern people have turned their backs on the reality of sin. They rarely, if ever, believe they have sinned. Errors, shortcomings, wrongdoing. Perhaps, but only strictly as defined within the system's secular and totalitarian value-inverted framework, not against God and creation. You could say sin has enslaved most modern people to the point of obliviousness. Thinking about sin would be good for modern people, but what about Christians who have an acute awareness of sin, think about it all the time, do their best to avoid it, and yearn to be free of it? On the one hand, such Christians are in a better place spiritually than their secular contemporaries. On the other hand, Christians obsessed with sin and sin avoidance may be just as enslaved to sin as the average unconcerned, value-inverted atheist. Sin enslaves, but being possessed by the idea of sin is also enslaving, and spiritually corrosive. For starters, it encourages a siege mentality and the constant instigation of trivial or false conflicts with life. In their efforts to avoid offending God, the sin-obsessed sense danger lurking around every corner and descend into a paranoid mindset convinced that every demon in existence is out to get them and them alone. Life dwindles to nothing more than rearguard action to defend one's salvation against negligence or a momentary lapse of discipline. Recognizing and understanding the reality of sin is indispensable, however, allowing the idea of sin to become an all-consuming motif in mortal life is spiritually corrosive. The antidote to sin is repentance, because it grants the opportunity to move beyond the sin and focus on something better and higher. Repentance is the acknowledgement that you did or thought something that was not of God, that was not aligned with creation and God's divine purposes. That acknowledgement lifts the enslavement to the sin. It frees the spirit to realign with God again, and realigning with God does not entail obsessing over past or future sins. Jesus came to save sinners, not those suffering from sin phobia. That does not grant us the right to sin with wild abandon, however, it does grant us the right to free ourselves from the corrosive pathology of sin obsession. Is this mortal life basically okay? Bruce Charlton. Is this mortal life basically okay? I sometimes think that this question, or something like it, is the root of philosophy. Is this mortal life basically okay? Seems to be something that, although in theory it need not be asked, and maybe there are animals, and perhaps some humans, that never ask it, in practice it seems to be something that demands and gets an answer, even if we aren't aware of this answer. Because, even to ask whether mortal life is okay, is already to have acknowledged that it is not okay, or, at least not sufficiently so. Although there seem always to have been plenty of those who argue that life is perfect just as it is, these have always needed to add if only people would realize it, which modification then, in practice, leads to all kinds of attempts at psychological spiritual training, discipline, meditation etc. in order that people can be made to realize this life, as is okay, or even utterly wonderful. That need to be made to realize that life really is okay, even the need to explain that it is okay, properly regarded, is in itself evidence of something being wrong with this mortal life, and to invite the question of why it is wrong. In other words, while anybody can answer yes to the question, for this yes to be more than empty words, more than optimistic daydreaming, or, indeed, cynical attempts at manipulation or careerism, immediately entails an acknowledgement that the very fact the question has been asked, means that life as is actually not okay. Therefore, if we are rigorous about it, we already know that this mortal life is basically not okay. And that something is therefore demanded of us, even if that something is merely an acknowledgement of the intractable insufficiency of life. Since life is not okay, what then? Probably the most prevalent and deeply believed answer in the world, at least in the Western world, is the leftist answer, the implicit answer that motivates attitudes and behaviors in vast numbers of people. To the question, is this mortal life basically okay? The leftist answer is, approximately, no, not at present, but it could be made so. The leftist answer implies that, unless life is accepted to be insufficient when it could be okay, the world needs to embark upon a purposive transformation of this mortal life. Leftism embarks upon this transformation of life, makes some change, makes indeed several changes, but it turns out that life is still not okay. It turns out that, apparently, if life is to be transformed such that becomes okay, this needs many changes, many radical, deep changes. Thus the leftist strategy turns out to be open-endedly expansile. Leftism entails, indeed demands, ever more and more changes, yet life still is not okay. The conclusion is that nothing less than a total transformation of life is required, change must be universal, it must therefore be imposed and enforced. Hence leftism is totalitarian, if the assumption is that this world can be made okay by transforming it, and when it is assumed that there is nothing but this world, and when anything less than total transformation always fails. Then totalitarian power to impose total change, is not just an unfortunate necessity but a moral imperative. No matter how often and how badly the leftist project to transform this world and make it okay has failed in the past, since it is, by assumption, mankind's only hope, then there is no alternative but to aim at an ever more totalitarian, more universal, and more coercively mandatory transformation, a new world order. The Christian answer is that this mortal life is indeed not okay when considered as a separate entity, and what makes mortal life not okay are ineradicable by human action. Because these include evil, degenerative change, entropy, and death, all of which constitute part of everybody, and of all beings. Evil, entropy and, especially, death are built into this mortal world, therefore this world is not okay. But, fortunately, mortal life is not necessarily the whole story, and mortal life is okay when regarded as an educational phase that leads to heaven. For Christians, mortal life in isolation is not okay, but with heaven to follow it and lived with that expectation, mortal life is okay. Why not sin? Should rather be conceptualized as, why be good? Bruce Charlton. Why not sin? First, we need to get rid of the double negative theology implicit in why not sin and reconceptualize the problem as the positively aspirational, why be good? After all, I understand sin to be any and all departures from the positive situation of living in full harmony with the wholly loving aims and nature of God's ongoing creation. A sin is thus anything, any impulse, thought, action, which does not harmonize with divine love. There are therefore innumerable sins, and everybody sins nearly all of the time. Since sin is best defined in terms of departure from good, it is clearly much better, positively, to aim at being good, rather than, negatively, trying not to do not good. To get someplace, i.e. heaven, it is insufficient to be told when we stray off the path, we most need to know where we are going, and how to get there. For me, the answer to why be good is that I desire to live wholly by love, to live in accordance with God's ongoing divine creation, which derives from God's love, and is motivated by love. Indeed, anyone who wants heaven, surely wants to live by love. Else why would he want heaven forever? Expressed otherwise, why on earth would anyone who ultimately desired to live eternally in complete accordance with love, not want to do so here and now, and all of the time? Wanting to live by love is just characteristic of the kind of person who wants eternally to dwell in heaven after death. Yet of course we are tempted, over and again, very frequently, to live other than by full accordance with love, to live out of harmony with divine creation, because it is short-term gratifying for us to do so. And therefore we often fail to resist these temptations, and we sin for much of the time. So we do not, as a matter of fact, resist temptation, and we do instead often choose to live out of harmony with divine creation. Given that fact, it might be asked, why should we even try to resist temptation? Why, since we fail all the time, and will continue to fail, don't we just accept the reality of sin, and sin whenever it is gratifying or convenient? But I have already answered that question. The answer to why be good is, if I am someone who desires resurrected eternal life in heaven, then no matter how often and badly I fail to live the heavenly life during this earthly mortal life, I will never stop repenting my failures, and never cease from trying to live better, simply because a life in harmony with God's loving creation is the life I want, more than I want anything else. Hat tip to David Earl for a comment that helped trigger this post. Improving people by stealth. No longer possible. Example of The Lord of the Rings. Bruce Charlton. A feature of mankind in these times is that we cannot be made good unless we are aware of it, and agree to it. 'Twas not always thus, because in the past man's consciousness was, to an extent, albeit declining through history, much more shared and pooled, and, to us, dreamlike, consciousness was less alienated from the world, less aware, much less divided and personal. In that situation, a great deal of our goodness was absorbed passively from our surrounding situation, much as happens with most children even nowadays. In that situation, it was possible to improve people by stealth by appealing, in effect, to their subconscious mind, by contacting and influencing not conscious mental processes, that were not subject to voluntary control. It was then possible, to some extent, to make men good. And this was, indeed, the basis of Christendom, of human societies organized on the basis of Christianity, such as those of the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, or the Roman Catholic nations of medieval Europe. But now, and especially in the West, men are alienated, cut off from that spontaneous group consciousness. So there is little or no power in the world now to make people into better people, I mean better in Christian terms, spiritually better, more good. Instead, people must make themselves better, and must do so by conscious choice. As an example of the ineffectiveness to do good to people, consider The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, which I regard as an exceptionally good book, good in terms of its values, as well as being widely popular. Since there is a good book read by many millions of people, one might suppose that this would mean that LOTR is doing good to some, or many, people. But that certainly does not seem to be the case. The evidence is that those who are most engaged with Tolkien's work, whether as readers, official fans, scholar or whatever it might be, are strikingly normal, for here and now, and mainstream in their expressed socio-political views. In other words, there is nothing to suggest that reading Lord of the Rings repeatedly, in depth and with avidity, has made any significant difference to their goodness, by Christian standards. Indeed, it is clear that even immersion in Tolkien is perfectly compatible with living as a cheerful and willing servant of the totalitarian agenda of evil. If it was possible to do good by stealth, then that would be happening with Lord of the Rings. But it is not happening, there is no sign of it. Those who benefit from the goodness of LOTR, do so by being consciously open to that goodness and actively embracing it. Otherwise good is not done. This applies generally. Christians cannot change socio-political circumstances to do good to people. However, the situation is not symmetrical, and people can be, and are, on a massive scale, be corrupted to greater evil, in a passive and unconscious way, and there is a truly colossal apparatus of media, and bureaucracy that is net dedicated to exactly this agenda. Therefore, as so often, and to quote Lord of the Rings, we cannot use the One Ring to fight Sauron, that is, Christians cannot use the apparatus of propaganda, and influencing to pursue a Christian agenda by passive and unconscious inculcation of good values. Here and now, men can be made evil, only needing passive and unconscious consent, but men cannot be made good. And, insofar as this appears to work, and some good value is successfully implanted by stealth, then it will in fact achieve the opposite of good overall. Because by encouraging people to be open to and live from external values of any kind, to embrace values that they have absorbed, passively and unconsciously, creates a mindset that will be overwhelmed by the far greater quantity and socially compelling influx of external values in support of the agenda of evil. Note added, an extension of this argument is that systems of training or initiation, that used unconsciously to inculcate positive values into such groups as doctors, lawyers, priests and monks, now do no positive good whatsoever. Unless, met with a positive, active, conscious will and decision, on the part of the trainee/initiate, such that any specific program of training/initiation is rendered inessential or redundant. In other words, we can no longer train people to be better people, but only worse people. Furthermore, this extends to societies, such that even if it could happen in the West, which it couldn't, a restored Christendom would no longer work. The everyone is a heretic but me routine misses the point about heresy today. Francis Berger. Nothing bores and disappoints me more than bloggers who insist that they are truly orthodox and that nearly everyone else is a heretic. To begin with, that level of discernment and judgment and its obsessive fixation on wrong-think as it pertains to adhering to externals hovers at about the same level as that utilized by the most raving, foaming-at-the-mouth leftist true believers. Screaming heretic from the rooftops is not an argument any more than screaming racist or transphobe is an argument. It does not exemplify sound or creative thinking, reflects no modicum of internal spiritual movement or development, and sidesteps all the serious spiritual issues Christians should urgently concern themselves with today. First off, the accused is probably already fully aware that he is indeed a heretic according to the doctrine against which he is judged, so what exactly is the point of stating the obvious? It would be like screaming American at a person who understands that he is a citizen of the United States. Also, what many heretic accusers fail to understand is that the accursed heretic standing before them may very well be perfectly orthodox in the tradition that he follows, a tradition that informs him that his accuser, not he, is the real heretic. Hours of meaningful and engaging dialogue follow. Then there is the whole issue of Christians labeling people as heretics even though they switched denominations, sometimes more than once, meaning that such Christians were themselves heretics at some point. You would think that such individuals would have more sympathy for others' spiritual journeys. But no, on the contrary, they are frequently among the most smug, arrogant, and vitriolic of true believers. Of course, we must not forget all the heresy accusations liberally being tossed about within one tradition or denomination. Don't accept the current pope as valid. Heretic. Accept the current pope as valid. Heretic. And then there are the lowest of the low on the heretic ranking chart, the unaffiliated romantic Christians like me who are generally dismissed as non-Christian or, sometimes, even anti-Christian because we insist on making our own way rather than submitting to one of the established denominations or traditions. The most common dismissal against such an individualized approach is that it is too subjective. Christians are permitted some idiosyncrasy within the religion, however, the level of subjectivity, discernment, and choice of an individualized approach disqualifies it as Christianity because at the end of the day, Christianity is a program, or a selection of programs, and the whole point of being a Christian is getting with a program. Yet getting with a program involves choice and discernment, yes, even for cradle Christians. The root meaning of heresy stems from the Greek heresis, a taking or choosing for oneself, a choice, a means of taking, a deliberate plan, purpose, philosophical sect, school. Choosing for oneself can involve submitting to one of the established traditions or eschewing all of them and going it alone. Either way, it's choosing for yourself, entailing that all Christians today are heretics, regardless of whether they acknowledge that or not.